So allow me, without any further ado, to introduce the next session, which is Leverage Gender to Promote Electric Mobility. And now we have Naomi Mwaura, the Executive Director for Flown Initiative, who's going to take us through that. Naomi?
I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to each one of you for making time to join this session. My name is Naomi Mwaura, and I'll be moderating this session. So in this session, we are going to be talking about leveraging gender to increase uptake of electric mobility. And this session aims to find out what gender considerations should be integrated into the design and implementation of electric mobility, and the gender implications and recommendations for gender mainstreaming in electric mobility, and what can we replicate and what are the best practices in developing countries. So today we are joined by several electric mobility experts who will share about their work. And to start us off, we have David Rubia from UNEP. David, kindly introduce yourself.
Thanks, Naomi. I'm David Rubia. I work with the Sustainable Mobility Unit of the United Nations Environment Programme. It's a unit that helps developing and transitional countries to formulate policies that see to sustainable transport, sustainable mobility. I myself am working on electric mobility, particularly 2 and 3 wheeler, electrification of 2 and 3 wheelers in developing countries. Have some exciting projects in Africa and Southeast Asia. Work with a lot of different colleagues, so the faces on this panel are all familiar to me. I'm happy to be on another panel with such wonderful colleagues. So this is just a bit of an overview, I think, that I like to always just throw into any talks that I'm giving, which is sort of setting the greater context of why we're working on electric mobility. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits from. It's a very, I like to say, it's a strategic and cross-cutting intervention that has a lot of impact on lots of sustainable development goals. We're able to, by transitioning to electric mobility, we're able to reduce emissions from transport, which will improve air quality and also reduce climate emissions. That's sort of kind of our charge at our unit, but it also has great links to other key SDGs. You know, like the transition to renewable energy. Is a big link between that and electric mobility. Obviously, for me, I think the biggest sort of selling point, if you will, is the huge economic potential from when you look at local manufacturing, creation of green jobs, links to ICT. I think for me, this is where we will live and die by, is how we're able to leverage economic potential of transition to electric mobility. And I think the last little point is that when you look at a lot of developing countries, electrification of 2 and 3 wheelers is a strategic stepping stone for electric mobility on very many levels. Just a quick overview of where we're working. As I mentioned, we're working in developing transitional countries. We have work divided across 3 streams: light duty vehicles, 2 and 3 wheelers, which I'm working on, and we have ongoing work on also electrification of buses, or should I say actually seeing to the improvement of technology for bus projects, BRT, bus rapid transit. So you can see there's a healthy spread across developing countries. I won't go into each one, but currently working on about 40 countries in one shape or form. I think for me, I just have 2 or 3 slides that sort of talk to what we're here for, leveraging gender to see to uptake of electric mobility. The first is what I call, you know, a very short story, success story on how mobile money transfer was a success in Kenya. This is the M-Pesa, which some of you or many of you may have heard of. The thing that always sort of grabs me about this is that the growth of M-Pesa was not necessarily because of technology, was because of the growth of the agent network. Actually, there's a good slide here that shows how there's a growth of customers with the growth of agent network. Now, these agents, the telco invested a lot in the recruitment and training of agents. They're not employees of the telco. They're independent contractors who have targets that they meet for the telco. Now, they're strategically located all over the country or all over where M-Pesa is available, and that helped access to M-Pesa services, converting a message that says you have so much money to currency. Now, what's of importance for this panel is that a lot of these agents are women-owned agent enterprises. I've never been able to establish if this was by design, but it is definitely a key reason why this M-Pesa is such a success story. And so for me, I asked myself, what can we learn from this as we're trying to see to the uptake of electric mobility? There's definitely a narrative in there that we can be able to decouple. And so recognizing it is a first step, and then understanding it is the next step, and seeing how we can then channel it into our work. The next slide is a common success story that we've heard, which is the Women Savings and Credit Cooperative Societies, commonly known as SACCOs. That's a very huge success story in Kenya. And I'll just give in two quick snapshots, one macro, if you will, and one micro. On the left, you see the Kenya Women Finance Trust, which is the largest microfinance institution in Kenya, period. Now, this is now an accredited microfinance bank that has grown tremendously from financing rural economic activities for women. As you can see, there's about 800,000, so just shy of 1 million. This is 2017 numbers, clients across the country, with a huge dedicated employee force. It's about just under 3,000. What hit me is the numbers. You look at their loan book, they're about 200 million loan book in 2017. Asset book, about a third of $1 billion. And now they are an accredited microfinance bank, and so they have significant deposits. This is all USD. So what we see here, from the small rural economic activities, you could be able to conglomerate to a huge economic vehicle, which is the KWFT. And there are many other success stories. Inuka Africa comes to mind, and a few others. Now, on the right is now a more of a smaller, more tangible success story, which is the Murang'a County Women SACCO. This is a SACCO comprised of about 25,000 members. They were able to raise $1 million from savings as low of 10 cents USD a day. And what they were able to do is parlay that into construction of a huge apartment block, 102 rooms, which they're renting out to students, college students in the area. And this is a huge statement of what these SACCOs can be able to achieve economically with impact, with local impact. Now, this raises the SACCO's credit worthiness. They're able to now do more. They're able to borrow against this and do bigger things. And so the members are able to improve their livelihood. So those two stories, M-Pesa and the SACCO conversation, tells you that there's a huge potential, as I mentioned, about economic potential for electric mobility, but what I call following the money. If you look at the next slide, this is now where I dovetail this into. So similar to M-Pesa and also with the SACCOs, we need to explore opportunities for leveraging gender into two and three wheelers, but looking at the whole ecosystem, not just thinking about how to get, say, more women riders or more women customers. We need to look at, these icons here, starting top left, where do the riders, where do they eat, where do they get their lunch, and what's that economic activity, who manages that, understanding that, understanding how they repair these motorcycles. Now we're talking about current, internal combustion engine, before we even look at electric. So we see what is the repair infrastructure, how is the gender demographics across that. With the advent of ride hailing, so there's obviously a lot more technology, ride hailing apps. We need to look at all the small ride hailing app providers and see, small and big, and see who's making the technology, how is it, even from the units, the phones, the technology, understanding how it's all being deployed and seeing where opportunities lie. Obviously, we have to fuel internal combustion engine motorcycles. We'll have to charge electric. We need to understand the ecosystem for fueling. It is a lot more smaller downstream retailers of petrol. So we need to understand how that is playing out in the space. We need to look at equipping, safety is a big aspect. So are there local industries supplying equipment, safety jackets, and, shoes and all these things, and see if there's an opportunity there. Licensing through NTSA and through the, through local county requirements and all that, understanding because there tends to be a lot of informal agents, people who people go to be able to cut through the line through NTSA to understand what's happening today and how can this be leveraged as an opportunity. I know myself, I've had to, when I'm trying to get like a logbook transferred, you call a friend who calls a friend who tells you there's this lady who knows everyone at NTSA and she'll be able to tell you what you need. And you're like, how many of these people exist and how are they interacting with the border space? And this is kind of walking backwards in time. I should have gone the other way, but when you're importing borders, there's obviously loans, because as we know, Ms. This and Emily has done fantastic research with this. She's a preeminent expert on this. In Kenya, how are motorcycles owned? How are they bought? Where is the financing coming from? Be it from personal resources, from SACCOs, informal borrowing, microfinance institutions. So we need to understand that. We need to understand how the shipping, how the clearing, meeting all the requirements, the agents for clearing and forwarding. When we follow that money, we'll be able to start having a money trail. I think it's also important to understand how people are saving from the revenue generated from this kind of this sector. And then the last thing is looking at governance and justice and seeing how gender plays a role there. Now, all of this is encompassed in a study, and this is why I said Naomi should be the one speaking. This is a study that Naomi is working on, or that is looking at the money following the study. So I think that's the last slide. But for me, the picture, the story that I'm telling here is that there is money to follow. If we follow that and understand how it's flowing, we'll be able to see which levers to tweak to be able to leverage gender. And I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for that amazing presentation. And yes, I will talk a bit more about following the money. And next up, I would like to present the next expert, Emily from Urban Electric Mobility Initiative. Emily, take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, David, as well, for this great presentation. And now I will speak about gender inclusive electric mobility. So how we can use e-mobility to increase women participation. So I'm looking at both aspects, gender inclusive and electric mobility and their mutual relationship. So my name is Emilie Martin. I work at the Urban Electric Mobility Initiative that was initiated by UN Habitat in 2014. And I work more specifically on implementing the EU funding project called Solutions Plus that is being deployed in 9 countries, soon 10 countries. And I specifically focus on the demonstration action in Kigali. So we will there deploy electric motorcycles, electric bicycles, look at the feasibility of electric buses, and look as well at things such as charging equipment and mobility as a service application to promote integrated, innovative electric mobility solutions. And perhaps to say a few words about electric mobility and electric vehicles for those among the public, the audience that are not so familiar with the topic. So transport electrification is a strategy to reduce air pollution, carbon emissions, fuel dependency, as David was mentioning before. And it can target a variety of vehicles, as you can see in the graph on the left. And transitioning to electric mobility impacts the fossil fuel transportation ecosystem. And I will give you a few examples to see in what kind of impacts and changes we can see. So first, governance and stakeholders. It's not only about mobility, stakeholders, and institutions. It's also about energy, industry, environment, urban planning, stakeholders, and authorities that come together. And as it tackles a lot of aspects, not only the mobility things. And very importantly as well is that with electric mobility, you see new players coming in the transportation sector, new mobility, new energy stakeholders, strong interest from international organizations, from donors, from the finance sector. It's also about business models that may change. You might know that electric vehicles are more expensive to purchase, to buy, but they're also, especially for electric 2- and 3-wheelers, cheaper to operate and maintain. And that can lead to the promise of economic gains for drivers, especially if you design innovative business models where you do not rely only on purchasing, but also renting the battery, that is the most expensive cost component, or leasing out the vehicle. And finally, charging infrastructure, because in order to be able to recharge your vehicle, you will need to have these charging infrastructure points where you often have a cooperation between private and public entities. So electric mobility is a pretty early stage in African countries. We see a lot of pilot projects. We work a lot with UNEP, with David, and we see these electric motorcycles, electric tuk-tuks, three-wheelers, some studies, some pilots on electric buses and minibuses, and as well as electric bicycles. So the very great cargo bikes of WITU and Siemens Foundation that Elizabeth perhaps will mention later. And also the exploration of the possibility to have electric shared bicycles in Kigali. So here I have not spoken about women yet. And what I want to say that electric mobility per se is not a silver bullet to increase the participation and representation of women in transportation. However, as you can see, it transforms the system, brings in new vehicles, new players, new funding, and hence offers significant opportunities to tackle, to reshape and increase women participation and representation in transportation. And it's really up to organization to really seize that opportunity to design targeted interventions that really focus on women. And this is not only a theoretical assumption, but we can see that happening, and that has happened before. So now I'm taking you out of Africa, going to Nepal, and looking at the case of Safa Tempos in Kathmandu, which are electric three-wheelers, which started in the late 90s, first with small pilots. And as they were able to reimburse loans quite quickly, it enabled scaling of the projects, the pilots, and access to finance. And there were several stakeholders who really supported women. It was international organizations, but also national and local stakeholders and organizations. For instance, with free training for women drivers and entrepreneurs. And the result that we see now is that more than half of the drivers are women. And out of a fleet of 700 vehicles, 200 women are owning and driving out. So the increase of women in the sector also followed and accompanied the growth of the electric mobility sector. And data showed that women driving Safa Tempos and owning them, they tend to drive at slower speeds and for fewer hours because they're responsible for care duties in the households. And that is a great recipe to make a sustainable and efficient use of the battery, to drive them at slower speeds and lower volume of hours. So in the end, what we see is really positive outcomes on representation, participation of women, and having snowball effects on household incomes, access to healthcare and education, and so on. So now coming back again to Africa, and more specifically East Africa, and I will talk more about motorcycles and tuk-tuks. I think that we know that we are facing two major issues. First one, underrepresentation of women in transport provision in East Africa. To give you an example, a figure, in Kenya in 2018, only 2.6% of Boda Boda drivers were women, 2.6%. The second really daunting issue that we face is situation of harassment and violence toward women, including sexual violence. And I think it's really great to have the work of organizations such as Flown Initiative or Plan International in cooperation with UN Habitat to really put numbers on it and to try to raise awareness on it. So I think you all know pretty much the figures. So I think it's a great move. It's a great evolution that we see when electric mobility projects take on board these gender inclusive components. And we see that, for instance, with Mobility for Africa, with electric tuk-tuks in rural areas, including women. In Kigali, it's also with the electric motorcycles by Ampersand, where they also try to assess where they can also increase the numbers of women driving. And I think when we design electric mobility gender inclusive projects, we need to do a few things. And I think it's pretty much aligned with what David said before. So first, it's important to learn from past projects with fossil fuel vehicles, for instance, motorcycles. So what is very important is before training the women, it's very important to train the trainers, so the driving schools instructors, because there have been cases where we have seen that instructors are not really aware of gender-specific aspects, and even in some cases coming to near harassment of women. So that is very important first to design an inclusive professional driving curricula, and also to provide safe space for women to train and to take exams, because it's not always the case. Sometimes it's out in the open and it's a bit challenging for women to sometimes to have people around watching and so on. So that is very important to take into account. I think baseline assessment, it's basically what David said, is looking at what's there on the ground. How are women involved? Maybe not as drivers, but maybe as investors, as persons involved in surrounding shops and so on. So that is very important. And finally, doing a broader work on raising awareness on these issues I've mentioned before, and also gender norms. As it's not only about, exactly as David said, not only about raising the numbers of women as drivers, but also raising general awareness on these issues. And to come to my last points, so a few considerations to sum up and what I've said. So electric mobility provides opportunities for ecosystem transitions, bringing in new players, new funding, new organizations with opportunity for women. But it's not automatic. We need to also be very proactive about that, really designing intervention targeting women. And this way, having promoting a stronger participation and representation of women, which will also make it safer for women as users, not only as providers. And in the end, safer e-mobility services are also more attractive services. So here I'm coming back to the question that you designed. So how, what is exactly the link? And not only how electric mobility can promote gender inclusive transportation, but also how gender inclusive transportation will also help electric mobility. So that will be all for me. I think it's very exciting. We're pretty much at the start and we see a lot of projects happening. So it's exactly the right time to work on this aspect. So thank you very much. And I'm available for questions later.
Thank you, Emily, for that great presentation. And thank you for sharing the success stories and best practices that can be replicated by other countries. And just to remind our participants, you can still drop your questions at the chat box or raise your hand, and we'll get back to you at the end of this session. And next up, we have Elizabeth Biba from the Siemens Foundation. Elizabeth, this is your chance.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Thank you for the invitation to speak on this panel. I'm currently working for the Siemens Stiftung Foundation as a member of our growing e-mobility program. We have projects in both East Africa and West African countries, and we are supporting small businesses and startups developing electric vehicles, all sorts of electric mobility products. Within the foundation, I'm also driving the gender-sensitive programming and pushing the gender side for the entire foundation. So this is a topic that is very close to my heart and ignites my passion. So I'm very happy to be here and talk a little bit more about what we're doing. I haven't prepared a presentation because we're at an early stage when it comes to gender-sensitive programming in our mobility projects, but I would love to share some pictures later on. Siemens Foundation is a nonprofit foundation that is headquartered in Munich, and we follow the vision that sustainable social development is based upon the 3 pillars of quality education, cultural understanding, and access to basic services. What we believe in, and that our unique approach is that we believe in social entrepreneurship and social businesses that have or that want to develop innovative technologies that can be applied to specific needs, problems, and can improve the quality of life, create new jobs, and encourage development in rural communities. We work with partners to develop local solutions, and have founded our own social enterprise in 2019 in Western Kenya. It's called We Have Kenya Limited, or short WETU. And WETU focuses on developing, testing, and piloting innovative solutions for environmental friendly development and green growth. WETU has 7 solar hubs spread across the 3 counties of Homa Bay, Migori, and Siaya in Western Kenya. And we are using WETU as a kind of an operative platform to test our e-mobility program and to kind of be on the ground and really with the team and really see what's happening, what are the challenges, how are the products perceived. We believe in the potential of technology, as I said, but we are not necessarily interested in the most advanced technologies, but we focus on the technology that can have the most societal impact, and that in a very specific environment. So we have started to develop or to focus on 2-wheelers at the moment primarily, and also have started to test electric outboard engines. And we have 2 products on the ground at the moment. We've received our first batch of electric motorbikes made in Kenya last month due to Corona COVID-19 delays. We're also redesigning and testing electric cargo bikes. So this is a picture of our assembly workshop assembling cargo bikes. 1 second. So we have tested this technology because it's robust technologies for use in rural areas. We want it to be affordable for small businesses, and we're trying to also test a sharing economy business model and hope that we can contribute to job creation, local value chains, and so on and so forth. As I said, we have just started testing those bikes. I'm going to show you the electric motorbikes that have been delivered, and this is a picture of a meeting with the Boda Boda associations. So coming back to the question on gender leverage. So promoting gender equality and including gender considerations at all stages has been a huge priority or high priority for us. And we are really hoping that we can implement a gender-sensitive program approach throughout the entire implementation phase. I want to say that we are at a very, very early stage here. We are at the stage where we are actually trying to define the hurdles and obstacles for women to access electric mobility. So we're looking for ways to integrate women into our projects and to reduce the barriers for participation. And we've asked ourselves the questions: why do we have less female riders in Kenya than, for example, in other countries than in Zambia or in South Africa? What does it have to do with the design perception? Are the bikes what kind of perceptions are there? Do they think it's too bulky? We've asked a couple of women what they think about it, and the feedback has been that they think that it requires strong arms and shoulders, and they cannot imagine themselves driving it, and so on. So we are at a very let's say early stage of trying to identify gender stereotypes and biases when it comes to the e-mobility of e-vehicles that we are testing at the moment. Then, of course, there was already mentioned the cultural perception in the presentations of my colleagues, where Boda Boda drivers are predominantly male. We're working with the Boda Boda associations to kind of break the norm and include women in their groups, and there has been some progress in Western Kenya, but there's also a lot of interesting outcomes when we ask the women what they think about female drivers or female riders, and some even say they would not trust female drivers, and we are asking why. What's the reason? Is it a risk that you don't want to travel with a stranger to an unknown place? Where is this coming from, and how can we? What is needed for us to to overcome those barriers and to kind of pilot new business models that also integrate women and are of interest to women, so they were participating. For example, we know that a lot of market women and in the formal sector is a majority is women who are using transport to get to work. So we are thinking of starting with a sensitization. Most women, as I said, have not considered riding as an option. So we are calling on women to register as drivers, to test the bikes, maybe offering some incentives, leasing for lower prices, free training. I think that was already mentioned in one of Emily's presentations. So in the long run, we really hope that we can include women in all kinds of components of speed, from the training courses, the maintenance, the operation, also just using the bikes, being a part of our business models. We have I've said that it's a very gender sensitive approach, but in the end, it would turn into a gender transformative approach, because I think there's a lot of this gender attitudes and norms in regards to mobility in general, and then of course also in regards to electric mobility that we need to analyze more to improve our own approach, and to kind of learn from best practices from other actors in the field, and establish a clear economic advantage of electric mobility. I think I'm repeating what has been said by Emily as well. And of course, we would love to have some kind of branding as a Girls Go E-Mobility, or some kind of, a campaign that encourages also the younger generation and to have the confidence to try it out and see for themselves if that's something, that they are interested in doing. So yes, as I said, we have started, we have a long way to go, and I'm very happy to hear what the others have been doing. And yes, I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And we are so excited to see that the Boda Bodas are on the road, and that you are actively working to integrate women, not just as end users, but throughout the value chain. Lastly, I will make a presentation based on Flown Initiative's current research with UNEP, looking at how to, again, the topic of the session, how to leverage gender to increase the uptake of electric mobility. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm Naomi Mora, the Executive Director of Flown Initiative. And as David mentioned, is that, as David mentioned, is that we are conducting this research, and we've had various interviews with social enterprises and companies working on electric mobility. And we realized most of them are funded by investors. And this led us to look at best practices and methodology for investors to incorporate when assessing the risk of investing into a company. Now, we also noticed that investors do not deliberately consider gender inequality in investment, and this hinders their understanding of the full range of risks and the impact that will have on their investment. And so what exactly is the impact of not looking at gender inequality? And that is the slide. And how can inequality affect the day-to-day operations of a company? So there has been research that shows that absenteeism and low productivity can definitely affect the company's bottom line, because when employees experience, for example, violence and even harassment at the workplace, they are more likely to take time off. And even when at work, they perform differently due to the physical and mental consequences of violence. And especially now during a pandemic, research has shown that there's more family violence. It's on the increase. And the risk thus is magnified, especially during this time. The other risk is looking at employee retention, that gender inequality and violence at the workplace can lead to a high turnover and difficulty attracting the right staff. And in addition, during the pandemic, many employees are working from home, and that means that the incidence of violence on a work site may reduce, and the potential for online harassment and violence at home has increased. There's also the issue of quality assurance. And this is especially harmful in sectors where they employ a high number of low-paid women, as they are less likely to report maybe quality or be motivated to produce quality products. Another thing that may be affected in terms of your investment as an investor is the culture. So I think companies try and measure and track culture through employees surveys and the like, but how about incorporating the risk or the probability of harassment in your own workplace? And these are important signs that investors can look for when assessing a company's culture and gender equality standards. And in addition, there's a reputational risk. I think we all know a couple of companies that have been caught in sexual harassment scandals and what that does to their brand awareness. And as investors, we need to start thinking about the future of an investment and to ask ourselves, under what circumstances does the investment you're making might become a reputational risk? And so based on this, we've just based on our research right now, we've come up with a couple of due diligence questions just to determine a company's exposure to risk that is created by gender inequality in a company. And so here we have a couple of, we've broken it down into various risks. There's one which is, for example, operational risk. And one of the things that investors can ask themselves or ask companies or audit company is, do the employees, for example, work in remote or isolated areas? And is there potential of violence on the way to work? And in addition, does the company provide safe transportation to and from work? And is there, for example, adequate protection for workers in isolated areas? What does the company rely on? Does it rely on remote workers or immigrant workers? Are there changes in the industry that would put pressure on the labor? So for example, now with the ongoing pandemic, and does this lead to an increase in gender-based violence? And how does that affect your company or your investment in this case? And then in addition, what is the demographic breakdown of the workforce, looking at gender, nationality? For example, in Kenya will be tribalism, and how does that compare with industry standards? In addition, there are other operational risks that investor can consider. For example, has the company undergone a gender equity audit or training? What is the company doing or offers to do to support workers who've experienced violence or harassment? For example, are there benefits? Are there support services? Are there compassionate leave? And will there, and how might patterns in gender inequality affect the company's product or service? In addition, we can look at other checklists or due diligence in terms of looking at a social enterprise standards or policies. For example, does the company have an operational strategy and plan that considers gender? And does the company have explicit standards about sexual exploitation, not just in its operation, but also in its value chain? There are a couple more, but I'll quickly go through some of the top ones. For example, is there transparency in terms of recruitment, promotion? Is there any wage gap and training opportunities for women? And does the company have policies to identify or close a gender gap or a gender imbalance in its governance, body, or workforce? Another area that investors can look at is on the issue of governance and enforcement. For example, questions to ask could be, what is the gender division of the governing board and management? We've been, as I mentioned, most of our research right now currently is interviewing social enterprises, and you'll find that there's a gender division in most of these governing board and management. Does the company have a process for employee complaints? And what is the process or practices for alerting the relevant authority, maybe internal or externally? How are disputes settled? You find that some people have informal systems that maybe are embedded in the culture, but are not formally written. Again, are the managers trained on gender equity and handling sexual harassment policies, or does the company just solely rely on human resource department? And then the other area that investors can look at is on organizational culture. Does the company have a history of legal suits and workplace health and safety issues? Again, what is the gender diversity of the workforce at all levels, including leadership? What is the culture of the organization, and does it reflect traditional or more progressive gender norms? And then does the company leadership set a tone within the company that allows workers to feel respected and safe? I think without a doubt, a company's leadership matters. And the reason why we are focusing on investors driving the change or incorporating gender lens when looking at their investment is that, well, first of all, it's important to understand the full range of risk that would impact your investment, but also looking at, do the leaders have the skills to be able to manage potentially shift expectations around the acceptance of inequality at their workplace? And as companies mature, the power dynamics within the companies shift, and how can a company consider gender equality internally may be a test for its ability to respond to the complex shifts, both in the short term, for example, right now with the pandemic, and also in the long term, because culture keeps changing, and with it, there are patterns of gender shift. So lastly, as I mentioned, we are still conducting the research and exploring this topic on how to incorporate systems into social enterprises that would promote gender equality. And so we welcome any suggestions and feedback. And lastly, you can reach out to us via our website. My email address is right there. And yeah, you're at the right time when we are still conducting the research, and we are open to feedback before we submit the research report.
Thank you very much, Naomi, the Executive Director for Flown Initiative, Emily Martin, the Urban Electric Mobility Initiative, Elizabeth Biber from Siemens, Steve Tang Foundation, and David Rubia from the United Nations Environment Program. There's a comment here from, let me see if I can get it from my, yes. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Excellent inputs and most encouraging female drivers in South Africa in traditional metered taxis and e-hailing sectors comprise less than 2%. The only way we will make inroads to address the inequity is to teach women to drive for free, thereby removing the primary barrier to addressing it as a systemic level. #women in the driving seat. Actually, that is not a question, that is just a comment, but I don't know if Naomi, I see we have Naomi with us, we have Elizabeth and Emily. Does any of you want to comment on that? That the only way we will make inroads to address this inequality is to teach women to drive for free.
Maybe I could go first.
Yes, Naomi.
Thank you very much for that insight and comment. I agree totally with Amin. And currently, for example, with Flown, we are taking about 33 women through our driving course. So the 33 women are working in various positions in the Kenyan public transport industry, or as we know it, the matatu industry. And yes, I think it opens them up to a lot more opportunities, increased earning, and more flexibility in terms of their schedule. And I see that, you've done very good work. I remember meeting you from last year's conference in Addis. And I hope you'll engage with the other panelists because I think they should know about the amazing work you're doing in South Africa.
Oh, thank you very much. Also sends her regards from Cape Town to Elizabeth. and she requests that you share your email address. There are many synergies that we would like to explore as we've been driving sustainable and gender equitable transport in South Africa for the past decade.